two pieces of relevant law are the Gender Recognition Act, which was, I believe, 2004, and the Equality Act, which was 2010. The important thing to bear in mind here is that the Equality Act came later, and therefore the GRA was not written with the Equality Act in mind. And so there are areas which, just honoured layman's reading, could be seen as ambiguous or conflicting. If in doubt, the Equality Act is the newest piece of legislation, so if there were a contradiction, the Equality Act takes precedence, although legally speaking, like, no judge has ruled that there is any contradictions in there so far. So the GRA basically sets out a process through which a trans person can legally change their gender, or legally change their sex, however you want to call it. It's really important, though, to understand, because this is probably one of the bigger misconceptions, is that that legal change doesn't make trans people legally identical to cis people. That's the biggest misconception, the idea that if you get a gender recognition certificate, you can just do anything that, if you're a trans woman, anything that a cis woman can do, and vice versa with trans men and men. That's not the case. It might have been the case between 2004 and 2010. That's not my area of expertise. I was only a teenager for most of that. But the Equality Act 2010 sets out very, very clearly what people's rights are, and it does have quite specific wording relating to trans people, which makes it perfectly clear that you can have spaces where it's based on sex at birth that exclude trans people, where that is a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. I think that's the wording in the law.
Right.
So
okay, yeah. Sorry, carry on.
So prisons are a great example. Trans women don't have automatic access to women's prisons. Whether they should or shouldn't is a complex debate that requires a lot of research behind it, most of which hasn't been done. But they don't have automatic access. There is a really specific safeguarding process in place. It involves risk assessments. It involves individual assessments. There's no kind of one size fits all you can go in. And having a gender recognition certificate doesn't really change that. A gender recognition certificate isn't a passport to womanhood. It's not really what a lot of people think it is. It's a piece of paper that kind of affirms your sex or gender legally, and it means you can have things like your birth certificate changed. But your birth certificate isn't ID. It isn't proof about your biology. It never has been. Like, it's a common argument that your birth certificate is a record of facts when you were born, but it's really not. You can be an adopted parent and get put on somebody's birth certificate.
Right.
Like, you can have a birth certificate where you don't have listed parents. That doesn't mean that you were, immaculately conceived. A birth certificate has never been an immutable record of anything. What this does, having a birth certificate, is gives trans people a few more rights in ways that you wouldn't normally think about. So, for example, if you die, your death certificate will usually read what's on your birth certificate. And if you die and maybe you have like next of kin that aren't particularly supportive, family that aren't supportive of your transition, there have been cases, and there are cases where, for example, a trans woman has died and their family has effectively gained control over the funeral, and they've ended up being buried in a suit with all their hair cut off with their dead name on their grave. And that's the sort of stuff that having access to a certificate can tackle. I was due to get married tomorrow. Before.
Oh wow! Congratulations. Well,
thank you very much. Yeah. So I'm having to do that in October now, but I can't actually get married because I don't have a gender recognition certificate. They're very, very hard to obtain. You have to satisfy a panel of experts that you've met certain criteria. One of those criteria is that you've been living in your acquired gender for 2 years. But any good feminist would say, well, what does that mean?
Yes, absolutely.
And you'd be right to think that there's no real guidance on it. And so it's massively variable. And so you end up in this weird catch-22 where you have to like play up femininity or risk that somebody might decide that you haven't been living in your gender. And so you end up with these really kind of like patriarchal power structures controlling kind of access to womanhood in a way.
That is a really weird idea, actually. The more you think about it, the odder that gets.
Definitely, yeah. It's a massively flawed concept.
Yeah.
It takes ages. It's expensive. It's kind of really unfit for purpose. It lacks clear guidance. If I wanted to get married, I have to get a certificate, because if not, if I want to get married, then my partner and I would have to get married as husband and husband. That'd be in the vows. And you can't get around that unless I've got a certificate. I can't get married as a wife under any circumstance unless I've got a certificate. So I've got to get a civil union instead, where you've got a bit more freedom in the vows. I want to get married, but I can't. And these are the little things that the GRA and with it the GRC is for. It's not for default access to prisons or default access to shelters. It's for those kind of things. And it needs reforming. And the government a few years ago basically ran a Q&A on reform, and they didn't actually propose self-ID. They asked what people thought about various aspects of the GRA, including the idea of self-ID. They didn't say, this is what we're going to do. They just asked those questions. They got a lot of responses. And in the end, they did nothing about it. But GRA reform doesn't have to mean self-ID. And even if it did, if you could get a gender recognition certificate as easily as, say, changing your name, just a declaration to a court with no kind of means testing or anything like that, it wouldn't fundamentally give you access to women's spaces. It would give you access to women's spaces that specifically invite trans people. It wouldn't automatically entitle you to access to women's spaces. That's not how it works. And I haven't really heard any major proposals to reform the Equality Act 2010 in a way that would change that in any meaningful way.
That's not on the table.
It's not really on the table, no. Nobody I've seen is pushing for it, certainly no major organisation.